Greetings, friends of the Great Second Advent Movement, and welcome to the Present Truth Studies YouTube channel. I'm your host, Brother Eric. Today we're going to pick up a really fundamentally important topic to help us understand what's going on in the church today. We see a lot of people are alarmed by the backsliding, the apostasy in our midst. Well, this didn't come out of nowhere. It came from things that have been evolving over decades. And so today we're going to focus in on the Adventist educational system and what's happened over the decades and why things are so compromised there and why we have literally the destruction of the Adventist youth, but also new legions of pastors coming out with very strange ideas and messages. And I'm going to share it from a perspective of personal experience because I came from an academic background, a secular academic background. So I kind of have a unique perspective. And I also taught at an Adventist institution for years. So I will give you an inside perspective of what I saw in just a few months that will maybe shock you, but help you understand what's going on and what it is that God would have us to do today, especially for young people, to counsel them what can they do to do something productive for God, to advance God's kingdom. So we're glad you're here. Come on in and join us, and we'll look into this in a little more detail. So here's our thumbnail: Adventist educational crisis. This is really nothing new under the sun. We, of course, have the flagship institution of Andrews University Theological Seminary, and the map in the United States here showing the Adventist colleges and universities in North America division. And so these schools have an interesting history. But ultimately the question is on the minds of many Adventists, especially with children or young people thinking about getting established in some kind of employment or career, should you send your child to a Seventh-day Adventist school? Well, the answer is no, but let's give a basis for that. We don't want to jump to conclusions, and we want to also be able to counsel young people what can they do to get some practical lines of training and become a asset to society, if you will. So here's some of the questions we're going to look at. We're going to diagram a little bit about the corruption of the Seventh-day Adventist educational system. Okay. I can understand this because I came from a secular background, and it's very evident that the Adventist institutions are going towards the way of the world. As Ellen White says in 5 Testimony, page 211, it says, the church has turned its back on Christ and is steadily retreating towards Egypt. So we're going to document exactly how that's happened in the past several decades. So some of the questions we're going to look at: is it a wise idea to send your children to Seventh-day Adventist schools? You might want to think carefully about this as you contemplate your options. And back in Ellen White's day, what did she say about some Seventh-day Adventist institutions in her day? You might be shocked. Those that are well-read in spirit prophecy are familiar with what she says. Are there any reliable places for young people to get an education today? So we're going to give you some counsel along those lines. And then what advice would you give to a young person trying to develop a life, a practical source of income so he can support a home and even a family? So we're going to try to make this practical ultimately in the end. So we'll start with this text for meditation, and this is the one that we have to weigh in the balance. This is in a book called Counsels to Parents and Teachers, page 86, paragraph 2. And note, this was published in 1913. So I want you to look at it in the context of, if this was true back then, have things gotten better or worse since then, almost over a decade later, over a century later. So here's the statement. There's a danger that our college will be turned away from its original design. And she's talking about Battle Creek. God's purpose has been made known, that our people should have an opportunity to study the sciences and at the same time to learn the requirements of His Word. Biblical lectures should be given. The study of the Scripture should have the first place in our system of education. Students are sent from great distances to attend the college at Battle Creek for the very purpose of receiving instruction from the lectures on Bible subjects. But for 1 or 2 years past, there has been an effort to mold our school after other colleges, that is, colleges of the world. When this is done, we can give no encouragement to parents to send their children to Battle Creek College. So if there's a trend where Adventist schools follow the trend of the world, then it's clearly a sign from inspiration not to send your children there. So the question, if this was true in Ellen White's day, is it perhaps true today? And the answer is absolutely, and we're going to document with clear-cut evidence. In order to get a benchmark to understand what God's purpose in education is, you need to read the right resources. And these books here were instrumental in molding my understanding of God's purpose for education. Now, in terms of the worldly education, I know from experience, from kindergarten all the way through high school, college, and graduate school to a PhD, I was thoroughly indoctrinated in the worldly way of education through secular institutions. So I didn't need an education in that. But when I read these books, in particular by the role of the Bible in Education by A.T. Jones, it was shocking to see what God's plan for education was. It's very distinctly different. And so this really helped reform my thinking about how education should work. And of course, inspired books, Fundamentals of Christian Education by Ellen White, and the seminal book, the Book of Education, really showed you a clear, distinct difference. So with this foundational knowledge, the question is, how do we put it into practice? And are Adventist institutions following this blueprint or this pattern? And this is where I'll share some of my testimonies when I taught at an Adventist school. Shocking revelations that the answer is no. They've divorced all of this. And I'll share some experiences later. So let's document the timeline of what I call the accreditation timeline. This is a key word, accreditation. Okay, what that means is a college or an institution goes to some accrediting body, which is a collective of, say, colleges and universities in a certain region or area, and they all have an approved curriculum. I sat on a curriculum committee at a university once, and you have to meet certain guidelines. If you're going to get a degree in this area of study, you have to have certain courses and certain prerequisites to get into courses. You know, if you're going to be a science major, you have to have math, typically calculus and calculus-based physics and chemistry and all of that. And so, and then of course you have to bring in the liberal arts curriculum. So all of that's supervised or overseen through accreditation. Is this the type of thing that you want to subject your institutions to? And the answer is no way. Not a God-fearing one. So I learned that Adventist schools began to compromise back in the 1920s. And the danger of this is they're following the example, like in the Old Testament, the schools of the prophets began to take a worldly mold and began to send their young people to the schools in Alexandria, Egypt. And they got warped and molded by worldly philosophies and understanding. And by the time Christ showed up, they had totally lost sight of prophecy and didn't fail to recognize the coming of Messiah. So the role of corrupted education and steering God's people off the prophetic waymarks is serious. It's real. This is documented. So what has happened in our lifetimes or in our era, this accreditation timeline? Well, this is a resource from the Seventh-day Adventist Archives website, and they have a detailed timeline of the rise of Adventist education, and I'm taking selected portions of this with key dates and what happened. So we're going to review this in the next few slides. So in 1928, now Ellen White died in 1915, and she was instrumental in setting up Adventist colleges, Sutherland and McGann, the Tennessee Agricultural School out of Nashville, the Madison School. But all of those things were in the wane. They were going away. And after she died, of course, compromise came in. And this is the timeline. 1928, the Association of Seventh-day Adventist Colleges and Secondary Schools is formed with its executive arm, the Board of Regents, to accredit Adventist schools. So they begin to accredit each other. You say, well, that's not a problem, but wait till you see where this goes. 1932, Pacific Union College, which is out in California, earns accreditation from the Board of Regents, the first Adventist college to obtain denominational accreditation. So this is accreditation amongst themselves. But you're going to see where this trend goes. 1933, Pacific Union College, the same college, is awarded accreditation by the Northwest Association of Secondary and Higher Schools, the first Adventist college to be regionally accredited. So this association of schools did not include Adventist schools. These were worldly institutions, secular. And so now you're fitting into their mold what they decide is the appropriate curriculum depending on what subject, if you're in business or psychology or medicine or nursing or science or what have you. So this is where this thing is trending. 1934, the Advanced Bible School, which is the forerunner of the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary, is organized at Pacific Union College, Angwin, California. So it seems like PUC is the hotbed of this trend to begin to compromise and retreat towards the world. Significant here. 1936, after heated debate, so this was the issue of controversy, the General Conference session delegates approve of regional accreditation for Adventist College. What do we know here? Well, we weren't there, but clearly there were Adventists that said, wait a minute, this is not a good idea. This is maybe heading towards the world. And so in the end, it seems like the liberalizing elements got their way and accreditation was going to go forward full steam ahead. And this is a waymark. I mean, they don't even hide this. Adventist educators today think this is all great. They say, yeah, this is a great idea. We've become more, our students can get educations in our colleges and then they can go to worldly schools and transfer their credits and all of that. They think it's a great thing. But is this in God's plan? 1941, the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary moves into a new and separate quarters at Tacoma Park, Maryland. So the whole theological training and subsequent degrees, as we find out, is a relatively new thing. In Ellen White's day, they didn't have theological training, with letters and degrees, masters and PhDs and all that. So these things came in more recent times, maybe even the lifetime of some of us here. So we see this development of establishing centers for thought control, if you will, through theological seminaries or training. And we're going to find, or many of you probably already know, that seminaries are often the worst places. That's the places where winds of doctrine arise and contaminate students that later become pastors, and they take it out into the churches. And friends, this is all by design. There are people that do this intentionally. I'll give you a hint. They've been around since the 1500s. They're called Jesuits, okay? They're masters at this type of tactic. They like to infiltrate seminaries and thereby contaminating future legions of pastors that get their degrees and go out into the field and contaminate the whole flock. This is no secret. This is a strategy. So let's continue to follow this timeline. 1942, the World Church authorizes its seminary to grant master's degrees. Realize prior to this, they didn't have degrees. And if you look in A.T. Jones' book on the Bible and education, degrees are prizes. This is out of Rome. Roman schools, the Catholic schools, is degrees like masters and bachelors and PhDs are prizes given through competition to the best students. And so this is not part of God's education at all. There's no need to have, God's no respecter of persons. So granting degrees through accreditation is definitely not a good trend. And we'll see where this goes. So Union College in Nebraska inaugurates the church's first baccalaureate program of nursing education. That is a bachelor's degree in nursing. And if you look at Adventist schools today, it's like they're clamoring to be able to give bachelor's degrees in nursing. Well, what kind of nursing do they get? Well, if you talk to any honest nurse, and I've met many of them, they're basically pill pushers. They go there and follow doctor's orders and make sure the patients get their meds. Okay? They become shills for big pharma. That's the bottom line. Okay? I'm a organic chemist. I know how the drug big pharma works and the collusion in the medical industrial complex. So do you want to become an instrument of that machine? This is where this is going. 1953, the General Conference makes the master's degree the standard of academic preparation for ministers. Oh boy, so now all your pastors have to have a master's degree in something, public health or theology or something. And they make it seem like, well, these learned pastors know something. And you'll notice pastors, they'll give sermons, well, in the Greek and the Hebrew. So they make it sound as if they have this anointed training, right? Do you need to be able to read Greek and Hebrew to understand God's word? Friends, the answer is no. Learn it in your native tongue, especially the King James Bible in English. Okay? I mean, I thank God the Spirit of Prophecy has helped me improve my vocabulary, English vocabulary, but I don't need to learn Hebrew and Greek to understand prophecy or understand God's word. So this is another way of decoying, saying, well, we'll go to the learned men. And you think about worldly education, from grade school on up, we're indoctrinated with the belief that we go to the learned doctors or teachers. And you notice the news media, the learned professor from Harvard or Stanford, blah, blah, blah. They're the experts, right? I'm like, this is the worldly way to think. This is not God's way. God can use humble agents. Ellen White had, a formal third-grade education? But read her writings. I mean, that woman was well-read. I mean, she read D'Abergane's History of the Reformation, 5 volumes, to her husband. Have any of you read that? I mean, she had an immense library of theological books and history books, and that she quoted from to write things like The Great Controversy. And this is all documented. So Ellen White was self-taught. No formal training in theology at all. 0. Read her works. So I'm giving you a hint. We can do the same. You don't have to rely on worldly training to understand Bible history and prophecy and philosophy and all of that. You can get it by studying it yourself. Okay, look what happened. 1954. So you see the steady slide, and it just goes from bad to worse. The Board of Regents extends its accrediting authority beyond North America, and the inception of the international denominational accreditation, of course, they're setting up colleges in countries like Brazil and Europe and over in Asia and the Philippines and everywhere. So they're trying to create a network of control. Accreditation, it's a way to certify everything's right? But it's also a way to control the curriculum. 1958, the General Conference approves the merger of the Potomac University, which is around Washington, D.C., and Emmanuel Missionary College in Berrien Springs, Michigan, and a new name, Andrews University, is selected 2 years later. So this is interesting. Andrews University is a fairly recent institution. I mean, in our lifetimes. Now, I was born about this time. Okay, so this is interesting. So they're clearly clamoring for worldly status and recognition, to have a established institution, a university with a theological seminary and blah, blah, blah. You see what the what's going on here. That same year, the College of Medical Evangelists grants the first Adventist PhD. Oh boy, they want those, what is it, acronym for piled higher and deeper, right? And it was in medical science. And that college later became Loma Linda University, the flagship institution where the learned doctors come. And you wonder what's behind the COVID thing and who pushed all those mandates. It's the learned doctors from Loma Linda and the General Conference, Handysides and Landis and all of those type with the PhDs, right? Trust the learned men. You see the pattern here that's emerging? We'll continue on. 1965, and ministers of Adventist Colleges and Universities adopt a statement on academic freedom that prohibits classroom instruction contrary to Adventist teachings. That sounds like a good thing. Well, it's just too bad they don't follow it. If any of you follow the controversies of what they're instructing in colleges like La Sierra out on the west coast of California, years ago, they have faculty in the biology department that don't believe in creation. That's been a big controversy. And openly promoting contemporary evolution in classrooms. And so this is a big controversy. I remember looking into it, 10, 15 years ago, not only La Sierra, but other Adventist schools. But La Sierra was the hotbed of it. So you've got professors of biology with PhDs that get indoctrinated with concepts about the origin of life and evolution, and they're bringing it in and discrediting the Bible teaching on the origin of life on earth. And so when I first became an Adventist, I was at a secular institution, and I was adopted into the Adventist academic community, and they had a big meeting at Andrews, Science and Faith, and there was a big controversy over this. And there were the two sides, one trying to define the concept of biblical origin of life and creation, and then many of these academics from Adventist backgrounds claim to be Adventists, discrediting it. Oh, well, science says. They want to believe the millions and years and long ages and all of that nonsense. So it's like, I thought to myself, this is unbelievable. These people claim to follow a Bible. Well, you see this real divide within the church. Okay. And unfortunately, this statement is not followed in most places. It's kind of like a paradox. How do you accommodate academic freedom when you're restricted by the constraints of a biblical worldview? You run into a problem. So the liberal elements will always argue for academic freedom. And now you look at Adventist institutions, not only evolution, but how about deviant lifestyles, LGBTQ stuff, and climate crisis change, and all these other Marxist hoax that are being inundated in secular institutions. Of course, Adventist ones, like hook, line, and sinker, follow the tail of the dog right into the pit of perdition. So yeah, it's unfortunate that this struggle of accreditation is what's driving this. They have to accommodate, the ever-changing flux of worldly institutions. 1966, the Academic Conference on Modern Church-State Problems convenes at Andrews University. Oh, so what's the problem here? Attendees challenged the traditional Adventist position on government aid to church-sponsored schools. So, is it okay now to take government grant money or get financial aid for students? And the answer is, you don't bite the hand that feeds. And of course, they compromised and took the bait. And you wonder, I did the video on the IRS 501c3 compromise. And so this is underlying issue here. When you begin to accept government funding to support your institution or your students' financial packages, then you're compromised and you have to follow their mandates. And so you wonder why things happen the way they do. There's a reason. This comes from a past. 1972, the Theological Seminary begins to offer its first doctoral program, or Doctor of Ministry. And Adventists will say, oh, that's such a great thing. They become learned. No, they become infidels. This is how you predictably become an infidel. And so when a theological issue comes up, they'll resort to commentaries, Protestant commentaries, and their own commentaries, and they'll disregard the Word of God. Okay, how do I know? Well, I did a video. You can check a link in the description box below about the stone in Daniel 2. All right? They changed the theology on it in 1944, and it's all documented in an effort to deceive the people. The stone comes from the mountain. The mountain's on the earth. The mountain's Seventh-day Adventist Church, so it's a purified remnant that comes out of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They don't believe that. So they cooked up and changed the writings of Uriah Smith's Daniel and Revelation. He was dead since 1903, but they changed the words of his book and brought in quotes from an ante-Nicene father, Hippolytus, to change the doctrine that the stone is all of a sudden Christ. That's not what Ellen White taught or any pioneer. So this is what these PhDs do. And when you get into other theological issues, the trumpets, the seals, the King of the North, Daniel 11, same thing. They're not predictable guides. They will lead you blindfolded into the ditch. So PhDs are trouble. In 1974, the General Conference Department of Education begins to issue the Citation of Merit, Award of Excellence, and Medallion of Merit Awards. Oh, yes! So they begin to give themselves prizes and bonuses and plaques they can hide behind their, put behind their desk. These are prizes. This is what Rome does. This is the Roman model of education. Oh, make the students compete and then offer them prizes. Oh, well, we'll give you a bachelor's degree and a master's. You get the highest honors, right? Friends, this is not God's model of education. This is worldly. 1981, the landmark Defense of Government Schools case in Australia establishes the legitimacy of government financial aid for church-sponsored schools in that nation. Oh, how desperately they want that government money. So I don't think this is anything to be proud of. I think this is a warning sign, a clear warning sign. And so not only in the U.S., North America, but worldwide. In this case in Australia, makes that clear. We got one more. I don't want to bore you with details, but these are significant waymarks, warning signs. 2001, the Columbian Union College versus Clark. The court rules that the Columbian Union College in Tacoma Park, Maryland, may legally receive money from the state of Maryland using the, quote, neutrality test rather than the, quote, pervasively sectarian, quote, end of quote, legal test to determine the eligibility of church-sponsored colleges for governmental aid. I mean, they really want that government money. You see a trend here? Everything's all about the money. The war, the controversy over tithes. They want to, police your tithing and return it all to the local conference through regular channels. By the way, there's the pastor, Marco Kolek, out of Canada, did a great video just recently. I'll put a link in the description on that where he calls it Tithe Cops. But yes, they're all clamoring for the money. And so they go through legal protocols and court cases to justify through the worldly legal system that it's okay to take government money, bypassing the, clear principle of separation of church and state and Bible warnings and spirit prophecy warnings. So you begin to see the trend of that things have not gotten better. They've only gotten worse, more compromised. They're in a noose. They've been tied themselves up by, taking handouts from the government and accreditation from worldly schools systems. And you little wonder why the strange things that come out of these schools. Now, this original timeline was compiled by a man named Floyd Greenleaf and published in the Journal of Adventist Education, to give credit where credit's due. But it's not anything to be proud of. It's an alarming warning sign of how things, to fulfillment. Ellen White said the church has turned its back on Christ and steadily returning toward Egypt. Well, here, friends, is proof of it in the educational lines. Now, I want to share some personal experiences. Now, I taught at secular institutions for 10 years. And then I was getting away from that. I became an Adventist, and I'm like, okay, this is not the place for me. This is where humanism exalted. You can't talk about God's Word. I got in trouble, even to tell the history about what famous scientists believed in God, even mentioning that in a large classroom would get you in trouble. The dean gets riled up, and the department head, concerned that you're bringing religion in the classroom. I mean, I just stated some facts. I wasn't preaching, but, people there's a no-go zone. Censorship is real. So I'm like, okay, I'm done with that. And an opportunity came to be interviewed for Adventist School. I got interviewed at Southern, offered a job. I didn't take it. That's a whole nother story. But several months later, Southwestern was desperate for a chemistry professor. And God worked it out. I ended up there at the last minute. They couldn't find somebody to fill a position. And literally at the last minute, a month before their classes started, I accepted this position. And thinking that I was really hesitant because I knew enough that about the trend of Adventist education that I was I wasn't my choice to go there, but the Lord impressed me, go here. I thought, well, at least I could be able to talk freely about what I was learning about the Bible and about the dangers of pharmaceutical drugs and big pharma, because I knew from experience. So I go there. It lasted about 10 months. It was like, I wrote a paper on it called Oil and Water Don't Mix. I don't know, my expectations were that maybe there would be some spiritual life there, but I found in that institution some alarming things. I guess God allowed me to see it firsthand. So these are firsthand reports. I'm just going to summarize some of the things that I encountered that at the time were quite disturbing. But ultimately, in the end, God allowed that to show me that He has a better way. So I'll get to that at the end. But one of the first things, early faculty meeting, one of the problems was they were concerned about the financial support for the men's baseball team. Financially, they were in trouble. What are we going to do about this? Costing all this money. And I'm listening to all the discussion, and then finally I just got impressed. I had to say something. It's like this burning in my heart. Of course, I'd read Ellen White about competitive sports, and I'm like, why are they talking about this? So I raised my hand, and I said, well, Spirit Prophecy recommends that we shouldn't have competitive sports at all. It teaches the wrong spirit, so perhaps you just disband it. When I said that, you could have heard a pin drop. Everybody locks on me like, how dare somebody say this? And when I did, the president looks back and he has this big Cheshire grin. Well, those were for her day. We here in the modern world don't pay heed to those. He basically said they don't regard what she says on those councils about having competitive sports. And I'm like, so it was clear to me that they may claim to believe it. They may have her books sitting on their bookshelves collecting dust, but they don't believe them. It was obvious. Why do you have them in the first place? So that was an eye-opener. That was literally within the first month of being there. It was an Adventist community. Okay, the union, the local conference office was nearby. The Southwest Union was there. Adventist Hospital. So there are a lot of Adventists in this area. I heard an evangelist refer to these areas as Adventist ghettos. I didn't come up with those words, but this would fit the description. Keene, Texas, a lot of Adventists. So in there, you've got all mix of Adventists in all kinds of meetings from ultra-liberal to ultra-conservative, and I checked them all out. Well, one was a Adventist forum meeting on a Sabbath. These are the liberal, what you call spectrum Adventist, if you will. And so I attended this meeting, and they were discussing this value or spirituality of Harry Potter books. It was a faculty member from Union College, an Adventist academic, talking about the value of Harry Potter books and how they can be used for educational purposes. I'm sitting there going, I can't believe what I'm hearing. Do they not know what this is? And I'm like very uncomfortable at this point, thinking, do I get up and leave or... But I'm just praying. I said, oh, Lord, what can I say? And the Lord impressed me. Go to your Bible. So I carefully opened my Bible, and I went to Deuteronomy chapter 18, where it warns about having your children walk through the fire and witchcraft and all of that abominations. So I raised my hand, and they looked at me. Everybody fixed on me, and I said, in this discussion, how would you relate to these scriptures? And I just read Deuteronomy 18, verses, I think, 9 through 12. And I stopped. And when I finished reading, it is written, it was like the presenter was almost speechless, and everybody was like visibly agitated. Like, who's the heretic? Or, I disrupted their genteel academic discussion, blah, blah, blah. But they were clearly promoting books of witchcraft. And it's like, this should be a no-brainer. And so it obviously went over, didn't go over so well. It was a very awkward moment. So I'm like, needless to say, that was the last Adventist Forum meeting I attended. But that meeting was attended by many of my, quote, colleagues. So they think this is a great stuff to get together and talk about the things that you see on Spectre magazine type of website, So that's common. Okay, for the students, they all were required to have this participate in this weekly spiritual meeting, okay, to give the impression that the students are getting a good spiritual background so the parents can feel assured they're using all that hard-earned money for their young people, and they're going to get a good education, they're going to get a solid spiritual foundation, right? Well, I was curious. I thought, I'll check one out. So I went, and the lead pastor for the large church there in King, I mean, this is a big church, big tall guy, I won't name him out, but he comes out on the stage bouncing a basketball, boop, 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 and he starts off telling stories about Michael Jordan. And I'm like, Michael Jordan? Basketball? And then attempts to make some spiritual application to it. And I'm like, this is insane. But that's what I saw. Literal idolatry of sport figures thrown in front of all these impressionable young, late teens, early 20s, very impressionable, by the lead pastor of the church. And I'm like, wow. I had a young man that I had a house across the street from the main church that I bought. And I was living there by myself, so I had an extra room. I rented it to a young man who was a convert into Adventism and was studying to become, it was a theology major, wanted to be a pastor. Earnest man, like me, a recent convert. And we studied the Bible and the Spirit process. We attended meetings of other Adventist and local churches, all kinds of them, looking for present truth or whatever. We found some better than others. But he told me experience, all the students are required to take a course on the history of the Reformation. And he told me some things that took place in that course that were very disturbing to him. I'll tell you one of them. One, when he talked about Luther, this professor. Now, I'll give you a backdrop. When I got there, I met some more conservative Adventists out in the town. I like to meet and talk to people. They told me, oh, you're a professor there. He said, there's one of those guys on the campus. Like who? A Jesuit. And they said, this guy. And I'm thinking, well, I don't want to be a judge. I don't know. But nonetheless, it's like, pay attention. How do you know one? Well, they're undercover, they're hard to identify, but you know them by their fruit. At any rate, this individual was teaching this class, mandatory attendance for every student there. So when he got to talking about Martin Luther, he would drop comments like, well, Luther had a drinking problem. He liked to drink alcohol. But that's okay because the Bible says blah, 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 blah. He would drop things like that all the time. Is that a good idea to put in the idea of young people that it's okay to drink alcohol? Because Luther did? When we have abundant counsel from Spirit of Prophecy about the dangers of fermented beverages, I myself had a problem with that. But when I became convicted, God took that away from me. So it's like, man, this is not the type of stuff you want to suggest to young people that are easily impressed. Another incident was he was showing artwork from Reformation era artwork, and he flashed on a screen a large picture showing women frontal nudity. It was a piece of artwork. And this roommate of mine was very disturbed by that. And he told me that he went afterwards to the man's office to confront him. Is this appropriate to put in front of young, impressionable people? And he said the guy went into a mental disconnect and says, well, my family was persecuted by the Nazis in Germany, and he went off into the non-reality. It's a deflection. The reality is that was intentional. They're trying to promote promiscuity, and I'll get to that later, which was an epidemic on that campus. So much for the History of Reformation course. It was designed and controlled by somebody that wanted to corrupt the minds of the young people. It was evident. I was reading Spirit of Prophecy. Ellen White talked about the danger of certain books where the sentiments of the mind of Satan was being introduced, i.e. psychology books. And I'm like, oh, so the president's wife was the head of the psychology department. It's a degree there. And I'm like, I'm just curious one day what kind of books they're using. So I went over to the bookstore and started looking at the books for the various psychology courses from basic on up. And I'm like, I was shocked. Neuro-linguistic program, Ericksonian hypnosis, Freudian psychology. Is that the type of stuff you want to expose Adventist young people to? I think not. So I'll say no more on that. Graduation events. Oh boy, what a spectacle. They have them twice a year. The first one in the fall caught me off guard, and they said, well, you got to attend this event. All faculty have to go, all students. We need to order this academic robe. Where did you get your piled higher, deeper degree from? And oh, I got it from this place. And so you had to show up to this thing wearing academic robes in the colors of wherever you got your higher degree. And this whole thing was held in the sanctuary of the large church there. And so you had this parade with the dean and their mitres marching down the aisle, and all the faculty come marching down and line up, and it's like this big parade of pomp and circumstance. And I'm like, in the middle of this, I felt so ashamed. I'm like, I don't value these things anymore. And then they took us all outside. We got to have our big annual picture, and it might show up in the Review and Herald, so you get everybody lined up in your robes. And I felt so disgusted at myself. I'm like, I want no part of this. I took those robes and that hat off, and I went threw them in the dumpster. It was just like, it was disgusting, but I couldn't believe what I was seeing. They love all that worldly pomp and circumstance. It's like, it's the greatest thing. They always like, oh, they can't hardly wait. And then the spring one is even worse. I won't go into details there, but I was like, these people are going to the world. I mean, I came from the world, and I'm like sinking in the kingdom of God, and I'm like, I was repulsed. I was repulsed by these things. Another incident, a notable one. Walter Ray visits a Sabbath school. Now, I didn't know who Walter Ray was. Many of you probably do. He wrote an infamous book called The White Lie, accusing Ellen White of plagiarism. Okay? Well, he has a following. Well, he was in town because a prominent Adventist in that community had died. And so a lot of people came to the funeral. Well, I attended a Sabbath school in the main church, which they had a lot of them, but I liked this one. It had the older retired pastors and evangelists. And I kind of liked it because they would talk about their experiences, and then they would do studies, and it was a systematic Bible study, verse upon verse. And I really enjoyed that method. It wasn't just a lot of talking. They didn't use the quarterly. They just talked about topics. And so I enjoyed that Sabbath school, mostly older gentlemen and their wives. Well, this man showed up at that Sabbath school and at one point started making comments that were very derogatory to Ellen White. And I'm sitting there going, man, who is this dude? I didn't know who he was. And I'm like, it's like that spirit, within you. I raised my hand and I said, well, I don't like what you're saying about Ellen White because I'm a convert. Her book, Desire of Ages, I read that not even knowing who she was, but that's where I met Jesus, and that's how I became converted. And that changed my life. And it helped me understand the Bible better. And I said, I can't believe you're saying things. And so this guy fires back. So for about the next 10, 15 minutes, it's like, pooh, pooh. We had a little showdown. And then it's like the head of the class is like everybody's just like stunned. They're silent, watching. So fireworks ensued. Well, finally it got about the time and the class got closed down. And this old lady came up. Oh, we're so glad you stood up to him. Patted me on the back, and I said, I don't know who that guy is, but I don't like him. He's like, man, attacking Ellen White. Said, do you know who that is? And I said, no, that's Walter Ray. It's like whispered. I'm like, who's Walter Ray? Well, he wrote The White Lie. Oh, so of course I went and find out about it. And I'm like, oh my. So here he is in town, spilling his poison. And they were afraid to stand up to him. I'm like, why? I would have thrown him out of the class if I'd known who it was. But at any rate, that worship service, I used to go to the 8 o'clock and then the Sabbath school, and then I leave because the 11 o'clock divine worship service, you couldn't go. It was almost like a barroom scene. The women were so immodest. It's like you had to look up all the time. And it was like a circus. Oh, friends, I could go on. I found out as a result of that Walter Ray thing that amongst the faculty there, that there were a lot of people that were sympathizers of Desmond Ford, this man that had died, that Walter Ray was there for a funeral, was a big Desmond Ford supporter. So I began to say, well, who's Desmond Ford? And I began to ask some of my colleagues in the religion department, and it turns out they were some of them were sympathizers with him. And I'm like, oh. So that's how I got exposed to Desmond Ford and found out about his theology. I did a video in the description box below, The Dangers of Desmond Ford Theology. Okay, so that's how I know about that. That influence is very pervasive on Adventist college campuses, and it's used to contaminate young people. Even the faculty gets sucked up into it. So it's a bad, bad situation. And let's see, one more. I don't want to go on. But in the spring, they had a student ball. They called it Mimosa. And so this is this thing that the reason I found out about it is that I had scheduled an exam. I was teaching a class in organic chemistry. I scheduled an exam on a Monday morning, and some of the students came up, can you reschedule it? I'm like, no, why? Oh, well, the Mimosa. What's that? Oh, it's a big event on Sunday, and da-da-da-da. And apparently a formal ball where the men and women wear formal attire, and they go to this venue up in Fort Worth, some fancy hotel, and they take limos and all of this stuff. And I'm like, so you're going to go do all of that fooling around and then you can't get up and take an exam for I said, where are your priorities? Are you here to get an education, or are you here to play around? Well, I later looked in the school yearbook and saw pictures of this so-called ball, and I was shocked. The women were, what is it you call it? No shoulders. They had these low-lying things, and it was like, I was shocked. It was like a very worldly appearance. And so I gave a little sermonette in the next class about where are your priorities, people? You're going off to this ball, and who knows what, but the women are dressed like whores. I said that, dressed like whores. That went all over campus. Oh, you called them whores. And I said, no, they dress like it. Here's the picture of it. I said, aren't you people ashamed? It was ridiculous, but it's like this caused a big uproar. Turns out that the problem with dating and fornication was an epidemic. There were some young people, one of them in my class, Brazilian young man, that were earnestly trying to warn about this. The holding of the hands and the dating. And they came to me, and we used to have a prayer group, a small group of us on Friday evenings, and we were praying, oh, Lord, this is total apostasy. What are you going to do about it? Well, God answered the prayer. He ultimately sent the message of revival and reformation through the shepherd's rod, and that's where I realized God has going to take the reins in his own hands and help me understand what God's going to do to save his church. But this whole problem of fornication was no secret. I'll tell you this, a former vice president, General Conference, had a son that was attending school there who was a ringleader in the apostasy. And he got caught red-handed in a vehicle at night by the local police doing fornication. So it was a big problem. And so this is how the devil corrupts the young people. He gets them there, lures them in, and promotes sexuality, and they go for it. And I'm sure alcohol is involved as well. I didn't see direct evidence of it, but probably pretty clear evidence that those things go together hand in hand. So these are just some of the highlights. I could go on and on. That's what the Adventist young people are exposed to at these institutions. I said, does that sound like a safe place? And the answer is obviously no. God allowed me to see it. And it came to a crisis when I began to preach about this. My colleagues, the president called me in and he said, you got to stop talking about this stuff in classroom. You're here to teach science. And I said, yeah, but what good science if you disregard the role of, pushing, chemical concoctions and drugs and all that. I started talking about that. Turns out that the students in my class, many of their parents were doctors and nurses at the big Adventist College, or the Adventist Hospital, and they'd bought and sold to the ways of the AMA and Big Pharma. And so, I was ruffling feathers. And so I was called on the carpet, told by the president, cease or desist. It lasted about 2 weeks, and I said, man, I can't in clean conscience muzzle. I know too much, because I know about how the drug industry works. I left that world. So it became clear writing on the wall. I quit. I left, and I said, it was clear they were going to get rid of me. And I'm like, I'll spare them the agony. And so I left and started studying this message. But my colleagues, when I wrote this letter about oil and water don't mix on the road to Cain, I quoted out of A.T. Jones' book, The Bible in Education, about God's model of education versus the world's. And I shared it with a couple of my colleagues. You know what they said? Oh, that paper's written by Catholics. I didn't say where I got it from, but they can't even recognize the writings of an Adventist pioneer. They have no clue. They are so indoctrinated with the worldly system, they don't recognize the truth. And it was just like, man, these guys are toast. These guys are toast. So that happened 20-some years ago. Do you think things have gotten any better? I doubt it. Back then, at least we didn't have the LGBTQ stuff going around. But now that's in, everywhere, every trend of the world. And your friends, I don't need to bore you further. on this. I'm just saying, I speak from experience when I say and concur with Ellen White, don't send your young people to the colleges. So the question will come around, well, what do you recommend for young people? And that's a valid question. What would be some advice, practical advice for young people today? Well, one, avoid all accredited Adventist institution. They're gone. They've gone the way of the world. Okay? Just accept reality. It's a fact. Okay? You have to find something else. Homeschool. Self-educate. Ellen White was self-educated theologian. Okay? Get the books and read and study for yourself. If you got young children, homeschool. That's the only safe and sane procedure. The worldly schools with all the transgenderism and all these crazy ideas, you don't want to expose your children to that. So homeschool. And there are plenty of people that do it, Adventist, non-Adventist. Of course, the Mennonites and the Amish do it, and I've been around those communities. Wonderful, wholesome children, not these wildcat maniacs that you find in public schools. Teach them practical things, like how to grow food and how to keep up a house and how to clean and cook and do all those practical skills. If you want to learn law, be like Abraham Lincoln, self-taught lawyer, one of the greatest presidents of the United States. So those are our examples. Focus on practical trades and apprentice trading. If you learn something useful, how to make things, fix things, that's the things. How to get trees out of the wood, how to cut them down, how to make furniture. All of these, there's this whole host of practical things. Medical missionary training, that's a big one. So, or auto mechanics, or construction trades, or running heavy equipment. All of this stuff is practical lines that you can be an asset to society. So work under an apprentice, maybe a master craftsman, a woodworker, a welder, or you like animals, you can do animal husbandry. You don't have to go to, veterinary school. You can learn it by hand like the Amish do. Start your own business. I've done that. Self-supporting work. You don't have to deal with mandates of employers saying you have to bow down and take this jab and all of that. You're free from it. You set your own schedule. So Henry Ford didn't have a formal education. He started his own business, one of the greatest automotive companies in the world. Took care of his workers. Okay? So don't be limited. God can open doors for those who step out in faith. And so there's plenty of counsel. Read those books by Ellen White. Take specific courses at a local community college or trade school. So I'm not anti-education. I myself had to learn about learning how to do some Photoshop and some web design many years ago. We got a couple websites up. Well, I went to a local community college and took 4 classes, web design and then Photoshop to learn some basic skills. I didn't get subject to the courses that were no use. I took specific courses. I got top grade in the class, and even used an opportunity to witness. So I learned those skills that are necessary. So you can take advantage of specific, if computer training or programming or something along those lines, if that's your interest. But you don't need to get the degree, because all that liberal education, you get exposed to all this humanism. It's no good. You can consider some self-supporting schools that focus on educational blueprints specified in Spirit of Prophecy. There are Adventists that try to do that. There's places, I think, in Oklahoma, there's the Heartland, and there are other ones. And if you don't have one in your area, start one up. Okay? Follow the pattern that God has given us. And so there's opportunities. There's some here in Tennessee, medical missionary type training. Some of them are small. They have small classes, 10, 12 people. There's another one. There's some in Georgia. Like I say, there are options out there. Look for them. Finally, some additional resources. We have a couple here. Mount Carmel Training Center. This is from the original Shepherd's Rod. This catalog and syllabus. If you're interested in a copy, I'll send you one without cost or obligation, electronic version or print copy. You'll be amazed at the curriculum in here. And this White House Recruiter, that was a recruiting call for ministers back in the 1950s to separate from, obviously, you see the Adventist theological training going towards the world, but God had this alternative to become true training for a gospel worker. And this is an amazing thing that was promoted back then to come to Mount Carmel Center. I wanted to go, but it turns out it's been disbanded. But you can still get elements of that through your own study. And we do ministerial training through Zoom and other opportunities. So the door is still open. And this is another book from Ellen White, Counsels to Parents and Teachers. To young people, read those books, the book of education, see what God's pattern is, and strive to follow that. But don't be lured by all the tinsel of the world and allurements, because it will lead blindfolded into the ditch, into perdition. And so it's a tragedy that the Adventist institutions have fallen to the level they have, but it's no wonder that we have the crisis in the church, because they've lost their compass. And so it's become on a layman, and this final work will be a layman's movement. That God will raise up people that will, follow God's word and study for themselves. So I hope you found this enlightening in understanding the root of some of these things that are going on in the church today. They didn't come out of nowhere. And so what you're up against, if you get called before a church tribunal or elders or pastors, you're going to run into their worldly training and theology. There's no fear. You just stick with God is written. Just like when Jesus was trained at his mother's knee and he went into the synagogue at the age of 12 and he confounded all those wise doctors and explained to them, it is written, and today this is fulfilled before your eyes. And so, he shocked them and turned them over, because their training had gone to the wayside. It's no different today. So I hope you take hope and encourage in that. Please contact us if you want any more information. Any of this content, we'll share it with you freely. We got the email or the number you can call, text, or WhatsApp. So we thank you for your time. May God richly bless your search for truth as for hidden treasure, and to cease from all men whose breath are in their nostrils. Until we meet again, Godspeed.